Good morning. My name is Karen Greenaway, and I will be the moderator for this panel. I want to welcome you all to hear some true experts on investigating violent kleptocracies. We have chosen specifically to talk about a particular type of kleptocracy, which the panelists will elaborate on. So I will start with having them talk a little bit about themselves, as well as just a little bit about their perspective on investigating violent kleptocracies. My background is that I am a retired supervisory special agent from the FBI, and most of my career I did transnational organized crime from the former Soviet Union. But the last several years of my career I did international corruption, which is where I met Dan Clayman and Debra LaPrevotte, who were some of the original experts in the Department of Justice and the FBI in investigating kleptocracies. Since my retirement at the end of 2018, I've worked with organizations like TI as a consultant to help improve not only the enforcement of kleptocracy, anti-corruption and anti-money laundering internationally, but also to improve journalist reporting and civil activist advocacy around these two topics. So I will be, as I said earlier, your moderator, and with that I will turn it over to our first speaker. She will give some her perspectives, and I will ask her to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Anrieke Visser and I work at the Sentry as a senior advisor on illicit financial policy. And I'm going to be talking to you about Myanmar. Yes, so today we'll talk about violent kleptocracies, not just kleptocracies of state-captured entities or government officials using their access to maybe gain some financial benefit for themselves, but that also use violence to suppress populations, media, civil society. And how do you counter, for example, corruption in those very difficult states for the local populations? So this is Myanmar. It's a beautiful country, the largest in Southeast Asia, with a lot of natural resources. And unfortunately, also the site of the longest ongoing civil war in the world. There have been regular bouts of genocidal violence. I'm sure you recognize the picture of the Rohingya fleeing in 2017 to Bangladesh. But also other ethnic groups are affected, like the Chin and Kachin in the country. And I lived there from 2017 until 2021. Unfortunately, the country also has a long history of military dictatorships. Since 1962, several dictators have ruled the country, with only a brief period of semi-civilian government, where the military regained power by having essential votes in parliament. During that long period, since 1962, they managed to set up a network of cronies and military businesses using access to economic sectors and corruption to gain private and corporate benefits for themselves. In 2020, I investigated COVID-19 emergency funds that were being siphoned off and misused, for example, through military-linked organizations. Also, subpar quality of PPE was being delivered, risking the health of doctors and nurses, unfortunately, in the country, as well as a lack of proof of delivery reports, and even bribes being asked for access to oxygen, with many people perishing away because they didn't have the funds to pay for oxygen in the country. Then the situation got worse last year with a coup d'etat. Since then, 16,000 people have been arrested and 2,500 people have been killed. There was a massive popular uprising against another dictatorship after already so many decades of previous dictatorships. People really tasted freedom for a bit and they didn't want to give it up. As the people continued to protest over the last 18 months, the violence slowly increased and was stepped up by the military junta. It started with snipers at protests, targeting specifically journalists as well. Then at night, prisoners were released and let loose in communities who were having resistance against the junta. Entire villages were burned if people continued to resist. And even a few months ago, a school was bombed and a teacher decapitated. So really slowly the violence has increased over time, unfortunately. During the coup, of course, the junta again regained access and control over all state-owned entities, which includes a lot of mining companies, gems, teak, a lot of the sources of income for the country, as well as having access over the central bank, ministries, and telecommunication providers, which they also use to target people who are resisting and investigating them. So under these circumstances, the State Administration Council, the body of the military governing the country, was even sanctioned as a whole, as an entity, which is a very severe measure to take in addition to individual sanctions. First, the US and UK sanctioned the State Administration Council, and then the EU followed a few months ago. Talking about the finances, so Myanmar, the country, was actually sanctioned since the 1990s until 2013 because of a popular uprising in 1988, which was also cracked down. That experience, unfortunately, taught the junta how to set up hidden corporate networks and how to maintain access to finances as an isolated pariah state. They are really good at maintaining, of course, with allied countries in the region, their existing networks. And these are just the legal businesses, like construction, timber, petroleum, textiles, beer, of around $900 million annually. In addition to that, there is a bigger illicit economies happening with gems, jade, rare earth minerals, but also casinos, a lot of Chinese nationals coming to play at casinos. And Myanmar is the second largest country producing heroin after Afghanistan, which is something that most people are not aware of. And research indicates that since the coup, the illicit economies have increased drastically. They are really doubling down on the illicit economies because they don't use the international financial system, and it's easier for them to keep money coming into the country. Interestingly, the military, because of all these decades of work, have set up a separate system from the normal population. They have their own banks, hospitals, even farms and own vegetables that they have access to, and they live in separate housing communities with other military officers. Often children will even marry within the military or with cronies supporting the military. It's really a separate group within the country. That also means that they have been able to protect themselves to some extent from both the economic downfall after the coup, as many international companies did leave, and of course it was impossible to continue business when people are fighting on the streets, but also to isolate themselves from the impact of sanctions to some extent. Of course, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do sanctions, and we should continue doing business with them, but they have a lot of experience, and we do need to take that into account. What we also saw is that even places of worship now are being looted, and high entrance fees are imposed. Often people will donate gold and gems to pagodas, which have been stolen over the past 18 months. And soldiers have seen looting villages and even stealing aid meant for internally displaced camps, selling or consuming food and winter clothes themselves on the local markets. So there is not a lack of topics to investigate in Myanmar, right? It's massive, both the legal side and the illicit side. But how do you actually do that? And what are some of the difficulties that we've seen? During the 4 years that I lived, I was really glad when slowly data transparency increased over time. In 2018, the then government released its first ever corporate registry, which of course is a treasure trove for an investigator like myself. Unfortunately, in September, the junta restricted access to the registry. Now only official directors and shareholders, major shareholders, can access the corporate documents. So we're really going back to the dark ages in terms of corruption and transparency. This is also happening for government tenders, procurement, and even the reporting of multilateral development loans. We really don't know what is happening with all the money that they received in the past and who now the companies are that are still operating with the military. But of course, that's why we have our investigators, and we do try to find these things out with whistleblowers and inside sources. Also, a very silly but practical important challenge. For many sanction designations, it's often really difficult to find out who the entity exactly is that is being sanctioned. In the screenshot, you can see the Myanmar Fund. So when names are translated into English, there's often different spellings and multiple names. People also have a Western name, and names are very similar. So often the date of birth of a person can be missing, or even their recent address. So it's like saying John Smith is sanctioned, and you're kind of left to figure out which John Smith it is, with significant challenges also for banks and businesses trying to do proper due diligence and find out who they are acting with, let alone information about who the family members and business interests are of those people. So I really want to focus more on data transparency around that. And then just closing off with some safety challenges. The civil society and media sector in the country has been decimated since the coup. In terms of media, the main critical independent media were sanctioned or banned in the first week after the coup. You cannot access their websites from inside Myanmar. Many were forced to return their media license. They are not allowed to operate anymore. 150 journalists have been arrested. 2 died in prison. There's regular torture and even rape of men and women in prison, unfortunately. And the same goes for local civil society, but also international NGOs. Open Society Foundation was targeted in the first days after the coup. Oxfam had people interrogated, and even Doctors Without Borders clinics were shut down, and then thus under popular pressure were reopened later on, luckily. As I mentioned briefly before, all communication in the country of all 53 million people is intercepted, stored, and monitored by now. They moved in and now control all telecommunication providers, and we know that they are monitoring and using keywords and also forcing people access to their phones once they are arrested, and thus the next night somebody else in their network will be picked up. So at the moment, most journalists are in hiding or operating in exile in some regional countries. Then I want to invite Debra to talk about South Sudan.
My background, I was with the FBI for 20 years. I was with Karen. I retired after 20 years as a supervisory special agent on the FBI's International Corruption Unit. The majority of the time that I worked for the FBI, I worked international corruption before it was called kleptocracy. By the end of my career, it was kleptocracy. I had the devout pleasure of working with Dan Clayman from DOJ. I was the investigator. He was my prosecutor. And we took a lot of money from some very bad people, over $1 billion working together from foreign corrupt officials. I used to say, I wish we worked on commission, but apparently the FBI and DOJ frowns on that. But it was a wonderful opportunity. When the FBI kicks us out at 57, mandatory retirement age. So I had the wonderful opportunity to go work for the Sentry, and that's where I work now. For the last 7 years, I've been investigating corruption in Central Africa, predominantly South Sudan. And it was so interesting as Enrica and I worked together along with Brian Adeba, and everything that Enrica said about what's going on in Myanmar is being mirrored in South Sudan. So you have state capture. We have a country in civil war. And the Sentry identifies South Sudan as a violent kleptocracy because the military and the National Security Service and the police forces are used not to protect their civilian population, but against their civilian population. It's used to maintain power, and power gives you control of state coffers, all of the contracts, and all of the money in the purse strings of the country. So if you don't know about South Sudan is in conflict. They've been in civil war. Even during signed peace agreements, thousands of people are still dying. The conflict between the state governments, South Sudanese army through government-funded militias, and then rebel groups fighting back. Over 400,000 people have been killed in South Sudan in the last decade, and currently about 4.3 million people are living in exile, either internally displaced or outside of the country. When we talk about violence used against civilian populations, one of the investigations conducted by the Sentry was what was behind the 5-fold increase in the use of rape and gang rape by the Army. And what the Sentry found is that there was a financial component, right? We mapped out thousands of allegations of rape and gang rape with their GPS coordinates, and then we overlaid that on a map of resources. And what you find is that there's a direct correlation between the increase of rape and gang rape as a tool of war in areas where the military was protecting oil fields, mining operations, illegal teak harvesting, and other resource-rich areas. And we just thought that was something nobody's reporting on. I mean, people always talk about rape as a tool of war, but what they don't see is that the military individuals who are giving the orders to use extreme violence against their civilian populations also own 2 mining operations. Their family is providing transport to the military. Their children are involved in mining operations. If you look at in South Sudan, there's a company called Fortune Minerals, and you look at Fortune Minerals, who, by the way, has 3 mining extraction contracts. 3 Chinese nationals own that company, along with, at the time of its incorporation, 20-year-old Winnie Keir, the president's daughter. And you're like, well, what does Winnie bring to the table other than the fact my dad's the president? And so you see that when you look into the corporate ownership of all the lucrative businesses, the airlines, the mineral extraction, gold, oil, either the protection contracts to protect the oil fields, or people who are transporting the logistics of the oil or selling the oil in the oil companies, those are all owned by political and military elites in the country. So it's a direct correlation between profit and the use of aggression against the civilian population. The looting of state coffers. I've been investigating corruption in South Sudan right now, and what I find is the level of looting state coffers has actually escalated. And the United States, we push for sanctions. Brian will talk to you about our policy objectives. But the United States has been successful at designating for sanctions a gentleman named Benjamin Baumel and another individual named Couraging Atir. But Baumel was sanctioned in 2017. Atir was sanctioned in 2019. Within weeks of being sanctioned, they incorporated new companies. And Benjamin Baumel is the beneficial owner of 2 road construction companies, and they have been granted $3.8 billion worth of road construction contracts after he was sanctioned. Couraging Atir, within 3 weeks of being sanctioned, a new company called Amok for Trading and Investment was incorporated. Atir's wife, Christine, is the CEO. So he doesn't appear on the company, but we know it's him. Immediately, they got 2 contracts valued at $1.1 billion to provide food to the military. And then a year later, his company entered a 5-year, $10 billion infrastructure project. I'm going to turn that around. 10-year, $5 billion infrastructure project to do these projects. And I'm looking at the signing ceremony that was going on in Egypt. And I zoom in and I go, who's the guy in the white shirt? I'm like, oh my God, I freeze frame it. I sent the picture to 3 people. I'm like, who's the guy in the white shirt? And they're like, oh, that's Couraging Atir. I'm like, I thought so. And I mean, he's openly signing for Amok for Trading on this contract. The president of South Sudan issued a $650 million sovereign guarantee related to this contract. The IMF stepped in and said, if you pay that, you won't get any more money from the IMF. So they supposedly canceled it. The IMF then loaned $127 million to South Sudan. Within weeks of the sovereign guarantee being canceled, oil cargoes valued at $400 million were given to Atir to make up for having to cancel the sovereign guarantee. So I mean, it is state capture at every level, but people within President Kiir's inner circle are profiting from at least $10 million worth of contracts. And we have an investigation that was put out a couple months ago. It was called Cash Grab. And it was how $1 billion worth of letters of credit-backed contracts were awarded to vendors in South Sudan. We checked export data. We checked the, companies were incorporated. 3 weeks later, they get $1 million contract. $14 million worth of contracts were awarded to companies owned by President Kiir's children. Another $12 million were awarded to the head of the central bank's children. And there's almost no proof of delivery for about $500 million out of the $972 million worth of loans. And again, it's just the looting, it's state-sponsored looting. The political elites, I laugh because, like every good investigator, you data mine social media, right? And matter of fact, that's how I found out that Christine was Couraging Atir's wife, because her family photo and his family photo were the same on both of their Facebook pages. But, I mean, the gentleman on your left, his name is Lawrence Lual Malong. He calls himself Smart Boy for Life or Young Tycoon. And this is a snapshot from a video he took of himself rolling on his bed in $1 million and how great God has been to him. I'm like, well, it helps when your father is the chief of staff of the army. And the other 2 individuals are the sons of Abuto Mamir Met, who is the minister for the National Security Service, or was at the time. And I mean, it's like, they shouldn't have this kind of money. And when I worked in Nigeria, Dinzane Alison Madueke's children were always fanning cash or on a private jet. And she would literally tell her children, stop that. We're not supposed to have this kind of money. So, I mean, this makes it easier to investigate because, we can figure out what hotel they're in. There are leads to follow. I've even freeze-framed some of this to try to identify the serial numbers off of the cash so that we can provide it to the U.S. Treasury to say, can we trace this money? Can we follow how these millions of dollars got to South Sudan? Okay. Much like Enrico was saying, the investigative challenges, right? So Brian and I have both spent time, obviously Brian is from South Sudan, but we both spent time in Juba investigating. But every time we meet with someone, we leave. And we are so concerned that the people who risk their lives to meet with us will be hunted down, killed after we leave. So one of the investigative challenges is how do you get in country? How do you develop sources? So a lot of the people that work for the Sentry are never identified as being Sentry employees. Brian and I are public-facing individuals, but a number of our people, we protect their identity so that they can go into country, they can conduct investigations, they can meet with people, and they're not putting the people we meet with at risk. When I meet with people, I only give them a 10-minute heads up of where we're going to meet, so that the National Security Services don't have time to come in and put the waiter or someone in the lobby at a hotel to follow me. And, you know, when I worked for the FBI, we had a lot of security behind us. You know, now with the Sentry, I travel into a country. We are provided with kidnap insurance in some cases, but by then I'm pretty much screwed if I need that. I'm like, don't take the blonde girl. Yeah, I'm like, my Fitbit, you can track it for 6 days. Please do that. We carry body trackers. We follow check-in protocols. These are the security measures that you want to take. But I also have door jams that blare at 130 decibels that I put at every entrance to my room. So if someone enters, I'm not going quietly into that dark night. You know, and so we keep in pairs. We follow strict check-in protocols, so the Sentry always knows where I am, who I'm meeting, what I'm doing. I let everybody know I'm coming too. I'm not from the UK, but I call the UK embassy and I let them know I'm coming, and I let the FBI agents or other security in country know that I'm there and try to meet with them. But you know, this is the negative aspect of working security. These gentlemen, Dr. Dao Ding was investigating. He saw that pharmaceuticals that were coming into South Sudan were counterfeit. He actually took them back to London and had them tested. While he was in South Sudan, he was shot in the back of the head. They said it was suicide, and the government said there was no foul play involved. Journalist Malik Bull was kidnapped by the National Security Service, held for 3 days, tortured, and he is alive, but his body was dumped in a cemetery. And he's not the only one. Afande Joseph, a friend of mine, also burned with cigarettes, being tortured, and he's alive, but he was dumped after being held. And when I traveled to Nairobi and Kampala, I used to think it was much safer than it was for anti-corruption activists. In 2017, Samuel Dong and Agre Idris were picked up off the streets of Nairobi, and within hours were secreted onto aircraft, flown back to Juba, where they were interrogated, tortured, and murdered. And then their bodies supposedly were thrown in the Nile. For the next year and a half, their families didn't know if they were alive or dead. So NGOs around the world were fighting for their release. They were already dead, and no one knew. And so you just have to really factor in the security not only of your people on the ground, but also the security of the people that are risking their lives to work with you, to provide you information. We communicate through Signal. We have disappearing messages. We use other modes of communication that can't be hacked. And we just try to use every level of security to secure not only our safety, but the safety of those people that are brave enough to work with anti-corruption activists. I'm going to hand off to Brian in just a moment, but I mean, the biggest takeaway you can do is how do you get your, I mean, like Enrica was saying about Myanmar, documents are not made public. The National Security Service is embedded in every major business in South Sudan. In the morning when the newspapers are going to print, a national security person will review the newspaper and they will just take out any article that they don't agree. So the people who wrote their articles have no idea that their article's not going out in the morning paper. There'll just be a white blank page, you know, a little paragraph where an article was removed. But they're in the banks, they're in every major business, and you don't know who they are. We have a report coming out from the Sentry tomorrow on the National Security Service and how they've infiltrated the business community within South Sudan. I recommend highly that you read that. You know, like every place that minimizes, that kills the opposition, that squashes journalists, and I mean, that's why we consider it a violent kleptocracy, because it's just very difficult to do business there. We've recently found like fake documents going around in Juba, one that appeared to be a report written by the UN, and the UN had to come out and say, we didn't write that. So the misinformation, the fake documents, Brian and I see documents all the time that look very interesting, and then 5 people come out and go, you know, it's a fake document. And we don't know is it a fake document? Is it a real document? And they're saying it's a fake document, and it's just very hard to vet that information, and you don't want to put it out only to find out that you're passing on a fake document. So we will be all answering questions, but I'm going to hand off to Brian and Adeba.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Adeba. I have been with the Sentry for 6 years. Previously, I was a journalist in Canada, worked for a small foreign affairs weekly. I covered the defense, immigration, and public safety committees. And previously also worked for a think tank and also worked for a US funded media organization covering Sudan in Nairobi called the Sudan Radio Service back in the day. So I'm here to talk about policies to counter the violent kleptocracies that my colleagues have touched on shortly prior to me getting on the podium. To discuss this, I think one of the things that we need to look at is what is available in the policy toolkit for policymakers to utilize to counter these kleptocracies. As investigators working on kleptocracy, I think one of the important things that one has to sort of embed in their thinking is knowledge of what's available in the policy toolkit. And that's important for one reason. In government, there's a high turnover usually. In our experience, we find that most people are there for like 1 or 2 years. And every time a new person comes on board, you really have to educate them about what's in the policy toolkit to actually send the message home. And then my presentation will focus on to what end are these policies going to be utilized for? That's the broad question. What do you want to achieve with those policies? So it's important for us to examine to understand the wrongdoing of the kleptocrats. What is it that the kleptocrats are doing that is wrong, and what is available in the policy toolkit to address that wrongdoing, that malfeasance? You've heard from my colleagues here discussion about corruption, and corruption is, of course, central to the existence of a kleptocracy. In fact, the whole premise of a kleptocratic regime is corruption. Because if you look at the original Greek definition, which is rule by thieves, a kleptocracy is a rule by thieves. So that's corruption is central to that. So if it's corruption, what is available in the policy toolkit to address that corruption? And why is corruption important? Because corruption actually allows the kleptocracy to flourish. Corruption allows the perpetuation of egregious human rights abuses. Corruption allows for the perpetuation of war and state capture. So, so when you have identified the wrongdoing and money laundering activities, human rights abuses, those are some of the examples of wrongdoings. And then, as I mentioned earlier, what is available, and when you've identified the wrongdoing, you can pair it to a specific policy tool to address it. So, looking at the countries that are the countries that we try to sort of get to work to counter kleptocracy, there are a range of policy tools and mechanisms, and I'm going to talk about some of these right now. First. On the agenda is the issue of executive orders. These are usually issued by here in the United States. It's the prerogative of the president to issue an executive order on something that needs to be addressed. It's a legal document. It authorizes government departments to work towards countering a specific issue mentioned in the executive order. In the Commonwealth, I think they are called order in council in Commonwealth countries, and I know, like in Canada, for instance, it's called order in council, and in the UK, probably, yeah. And those can be utilized to counter kleptocracy. And then, I think one of the most potent tools in the toolkit is the financial advisory. Here in the United States, you have FinCEN advisories. A good example of a financial advisory to counter corruption is one issued in 2017 on South Sudan, basically. And I must say that we did a lot of work to actually get that going. The then Undersecretary in the Treasury went to Kenya, and together with some of our people represented in the press conference, a FinCEN advisory was issued. And what's this advisory? Basically, it's an advisory on political corruption and risks in South Sudan, and it warns financial institutions to be aware of being complicit in enabling corruption that perpetuates war, that perpetuates egregious human rights abuses. And this is a very powerful toolkit. If in your various in your various countries that you work on, if you can get officials to actually issue that, that would be an important element in the fight against kleptocracies. In the UK, the equivalent of the financial advisory is issued by the National Crime Agency on behalf of the National Economic Crime Center, I think. And there's a good example of that in March 2020, I think. The UK issued one on South Sudan. And in Canada, you have the Special Economic Measures Act, which is also utilized under circumstances of a grave breach of the international peace. Canada actually will only issue that when it's sort of coming, or it's based from a directive coming from the United Nations Security Council. Like, for instance, when the Security Council issues sanctions on individuals, and if those individuals are deemed liable for action by Canadian authorities, then a regulation under the Special Economic Measures Act can be released, and it's used to counter also human rights abuses, corruption, anything that constitutes a breach to international peace. Then there is the Global Magnitsky Act. Several countries have taken steps to actually enact GLOMAG legislation, and you have Canada and the United States. And under the GLOMAG regulations, there's a number of things that can happen: asset freezes, visa bans, and all that. All these under the rubric of course, sanctions. And then I want to move on to the next important question about, like, okay, so here's wrongdoing, here's what's available in the policy toolkit to address the wrongdoing, but then what is the larger picture that you want to do? What should your measures, if you enact sanctions, you Global Magnitsky acts on people, what is the end game that you want to see? Inevitably, of course, all these measures are supposed to induce behavior change. And so that's the broad question here that sanctions are supposed to answer. So I think one of the important things to consider here is that when you impose sanctions and you want to see a strategy, you want to see an outcome that addresses the question or induces a behavior change. So it's important to peg the sanctions to a strategy, a clearly defined political strategy. And for instance, if you take the case of South Sudan, which I'm familiar with and I will speak on, there's a peace process, there's a peace agreement whose elements are actually designed to counter kleptocracy if implemented to the letter. And then here's sanctions, but what do you want to see? If you peg the Sanctions Act to something in the peace, to a benchmark in the peace agreement, for instance, say for the peace agreement spells out that there should be a reform, a profound reform of institutions that offer accountability. Sanctions should therefore be considered in that realm of, here's why we're punishing you, or I mean, the word punishing is not a good term, actually, but here's why we're enacting these sanctions. Here's what we want you to reach, to achieve. For instance, if you reform your institutions within this specified period, those sanctions can come off. Here's why there's an arms embargo on you. Here are certain benchmarks that we want to see. We want to see all the forces unified as spelled out in the agreement. And so those are the benchmarks that need to be considered when enacting sanctions. When sanctions are just slapped on people, they don't really, without a strategy, without a political strategy, they don't achieve their end. And that is one of the main shortcomings of sanctions regimes over the years, from the 90s up to now. And subsequently, of course, sanctions have a bad rap. When you say sanctions, everyone's thinking about what happened in Iran, what happened in Sudan in the 90s, and how they affect a broad set of people rather than targeted individuals. So what we advocate for, targeted measures at specific people or entities, and pegged to a political strategy, backed by a process of diplomacy to actually send the message home and to realize the end result. I think I will stop here, but before I run off, I just want to talk about what's actually wrong with sanctions how they are implemented in the first place. In the past, sanctions have targeted middle-level officers with no command and control responsibilities, and that's true of UN sanctions, for instance, and why they're not effective. So there's also the issue of targeting people with no financial footprint, no connection to the broader global financial system. UN sanctions, for instance, targeted a warlord in South Sudan called Peter Gadet. He's illiterate, commands a sizable force and has a lot of influence, and has been at war for more than half of his life. So when he was told, when he was told that they've enacted sanctions on you, and he's a Nilot, wealth is measured in the number of cattle you own, he asked, "Are they going to take away my cows?" And when he was told, "No, actually, probably not," it's like, let them go to hell. So, and he continued doing what he was doing without any recrimination. The other thing is sanctions are intermittent, especially from the UN end. And this is something to consider, even when you urge a country like, say, Canada to take sanctions. You have to consider this. If they're intermittent, and far in between and take a long time, no one actually, they slap sanctions on people and then they don't, or entities, and then there's no follow-up, those sanctions are not going to be effective. So what needs to change when you enact sanctions, or when governments enact sanctions? You need to target people who have a financial footprint and a connection to the global financial system. These people must be prominent at the top level, not lower level ranking officials or commanders with minimal command and control responsibilities. Those don't work. Then there's the issue of not only targeting the individual, but like the network in the individual. Like there's the individual and the entity. There's the middleman or woman or entity that facilitates the corruption to happen. And then there's the financial system, the global financial system, that needs to be educated on upping up their know your customer duties, due diligence, and all that. Yeah, and I think the other thing is, as investigators, as you uncover this corruption, you uncover actors and entities. It is incumbent upon us also to share that knowledge with the banking sector and say, hey, here's what's happening. Here's wrongdoing being done by these people, and you are banking in that country. We want you to elevate your sense of your duty of ensuring that no bad actors get into your banking system. I'll stop here and answer questions later, hopefully. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Dan Clayman. I'm with the National Security Council here in Washington, but I'm actually on loan to the National Security Council from the Department of Justice, and I think I'm here for both reasons. If you were to go to the famous line, "Who am I and why am I here?" I'm here to talk about sort of both aspects, I think. What has been the experience in investigating complex kleptocracies, and what is it that we can do, and what is it that we are doing? I hope we have that discussion. I've served for more than 20 years in the money laundering and asset recovery section of the Department of Justice, working primarily on kleptocracy investigations, litigation, and some policy. And in that capacity, I was a manager in our kleptocracy asset recovery initiative program designed to specifically target kleptocracies and the extent to which they affect the U.S. financial system to give us some jurisdiction. At the National Security Council, I serve as the Director of Anti-Corruption, and I've only been there a couple of months, but it's a really unique opportunity for me to try and see what I can do to advance our policy objectives, and I think right now is a very exciting time to be working in anti-corruption. In part, I think, due to the, you can get a little feedback here, to President Biden's strategy on countering corruption that was released last year. I can't claim any responsibility for it, but I'm pleased to be part of the effort to try and implement it. I think the other reason I would say that I'm here is because we've heard a lot of the terrific work that civil society is doing to expose and investigate complex, violent kleptocracy. And I think the examples that we've heard about are really worth listening to. But I think it also bears noting that we have to also look at this as a collective responsibility, and and so hopefully my presence here in this discussion will further the understanding that this really is a partnership between civil society and government, people in the private sector, activists, journalists, across the spectrum of the people who are involved in the fight against kleptocracy. The other thing I wanted to note, and sorry for the long introduction, but is that I recognize that I bring a U.S. perspective to investigations. That's where I live, that's where I work, that's what I have been involved in, and I recognize that that's not the only perspective out there, and that I'm hopeful that we will have time for discussion with this this group of people from so many different walks of life and so many different places to understand what it means to deal with kleptocracy, especially violent kleptocracy, because it's a real challenge. I think whether you're an investigative journalist, whether you're an activist, whether you're a witness, violent kleptocracies are something that are intractable and very difficult to address. And in the U.S., we're fortunate that U.S. prosecutors and agents are rarely targeted for violence. That's not true of journalists working in some of the most challenging environments around the world. It's not true of prosecutors, investigators who may also be working against kleptocracies in their own countries. And so I think it bears some mention that we need to hear from that perspective as well. So how do you investigate kleptocracy, especially violent kleptocracy? I think, first of all, we have to think about what's the end goal, as my colleague Brian just mentioned. In a criminal investigation, it really boils down to, at real bottom, that you need to be able to identify what the crime is that occurred and its connection to an individual, a corporation, or the asset that you're trying to seize. And certainly there are a lot of different components that go into that. How are you going to get the evidence? How are you going to arrest the person? Where are they located? That kind of thing. But at bottom, we need the evidence, and that's what the investigations are about. And typically, we really need to hear from people with what we call percipient knowledge, firsthand, direct knowledge, in order to prove to a criminal standard, or even in a civil proceeding, a judicial standard, that there was a particular criminal act. In a domestic investigation, the police powers of the state allow us to go and do that. In the United States, we can issue grand jury subpoenas, we can use the powers of the state to surveil people, we can talk to witnesses, we can do all of that because, you know, that's the power of the state to the police power of the state. Where part of the conduct occurs in another country, especially a country where there's state capture, you don't have that opportunity because you can't just waltz into another country and start talking to a lot of witnesses. You can't subpoena records from a bank. And certainly there are some transnational powers that we exercise to try and address those issues, but they're often really directly related to the particular jurisdictional nexus to the U.S., the financial system, for example. And so what do we do? I think, you know, it gets more challenging when well, first of all, if we're looking for evidence abroad in any kind of a transnational case, we're going to count on our partners. If there's evidence halfway across the world, we're going to make a mutual legal assistance request to another country and try and get them to use their police powers to get the evidence for us to further our investigation. I think hopefully we'll hear how journalists overcome those kinds of difficulties and civil society as well. But in the criminal context, we're going to make a formal request because we need evidence. And I think it's important to also think about evidence versus information. We actually need to be able to authenticate records. We need to have, as I said, people with direct knowledge come forward. And so we do need those formal mechanisms. But where you have a state capture, you don't have that opportunity. You can't ask the other government to provide evidence on the son of the kleptocrat. It's not something you're often going to get assistance on. I guess you can ask. Certainly it's important to ask. If you don't ask, you don't get. But the higher up and the more state capture there is, the more difficult it is to get the evidence that you need. And I think we've seen it in some unusual spaces. I know in my practice, we had one instance where the country we were working with and that we were trying to help through an asset recovery action actually try to dissolve a restraint that we had imposed because they had entered into a side agreement with one of the perpetrators. And so it can be, even in a nonviolent situation, corruption investigations can be very challenging. But then if you add the threat of violence to witnesses, journalists, activists, and investigators, that it becomes even more difficult. So I think very briefly, I will mention like 5 or 6 ideas of how do we go about doing some of these investigations. And I certainly look forward to hearing more about what you think are additional tools we can bring. So first, I think we have to think about it as a shared responsibility. It's not, an investigation into violent kleptocracy is not going to be successful unless, frankly, there are multiple investigations. Because the environment is such that the investigation is not likely to be successful on its own in the country, even where there is, it's not a pure state capture situation. There's going to be a lot of challenges to the investigations. And so we need to recognize that the investigations may not be possible in the other country. So then how do you get the evidence to prove the crime? You get it from witnesses who are willing to come forward. But the problem is that I think you have to be cognizant of the risk to the witnesses, as Deb described a little earlier. And I think that has to be at the forefront of your investigation. You have to be cognizant that what you ask for from your partners in other countries, whether they're, as I said, witnesses or colleagues in law enforcement or colleagues in journalism, is going to put them at risk. So I think you have to be very, you have to take the countermeasures that we've heard a little bit about, and you also have to be upfront, frankly, with your potential witnesses and colleagues about what the risks are for them, because we can't make that decision for them about what the risks are for them and their families. A third, I think we have to be looking for evidence outside the country that's of the violent kleptocracy. That means expats, it means business persons who have engaged in business in that country. It means civil society organizations and journalists in other countries who can help identify where there is evidence and what happened. Because it's very difficult. We heard a little bit about some of the challenges in translation and in just one document. Then we heard a little bit about challenges in forgeries. It's hard to understand when you don't have the history of having lived in whatever the particular country is. Those of you who are not from the United States may not have recognized my reference to, you know, who am I and why am I here? That's a line from a politician from some years ago. But you're not going to know that context in the other country. And so you need to help get help from the people who do know the community. And I think there are some things that we are doing. Recently, we launched a kleptocracy asset recovery rewards program, which incentivizes people to come forward with rewards for evidence. So I think we have to think creatively about those types of solutions to try and get to the evidence that we need. And then sort of returning a little bit to the shared responsibility theme, I think the fourth point that I would say that would help in these types of investigations is looking at it from the perspective of not just law enforcement and not just investigative journalism, not just you know, our own particular silos, but trying to figure out where is it that we can get help. So I know that in a number of societies where there is state capture, law enforcement is not necessarily trusted, and with good reason. So it may be that U.S. law enforcement, when it's looking for witnesses, even expats in another country, should be working with civil society who can help identify those people who are willing to come forward and can help sort of be the go-between to try and explain what some of the risks are to them if they were to come forward, and what the limits of protection there are that are available. So I think looking for those types of solutions. Sometimes it means that we have to engage with our diplomatic colleagues. Typically, the law enforcement community doesn't engage directly with diplomats, but sometimes if you are not getting a response to your mutual legal assistance request, or you are facing other impediments, you need to reach out in that way. And of course, looking at other authorities, as we heard a little bit about the sanctions programs. If you're investigating violent kleptocracies, blocking orders that come down through the global Magnitsky type of programs can be very helpful in not just stopping the flow of criminal proceeds, but also forcing those to come to light where you have a financial trail that you can pick up. The fifth thing I would say about investigating violent kleptocracies, and this happens, I think, in any kind of kleptocracy, is you have to be ready when the window opens. Corruption goes in cycles, and especially where there is at least some fracturing in the kleptocracy, or there are competing oligarchs or kleptocrats involved, there may be windows when evidence becomes available. And it's important to use those opportunities to get as much evidence as possible, because the window will close again. Politics will change, and the window will close. And these investigations are ordinarily long haul. They don't take months, they don't take years, they take multiple years. And so taking advantage of those opportunities when they come is important. And I would also think that unfortunately it also those who are investigating in the country may have very short windows. I've heard some colleagues who have been appointed to anti-corruption commissions and who have led those types of investigations say that it's 1.5 years before they become the targets of, even after there's been a change in government. So I think we have to think about how do we protect those individuals, and how do we protect the information by getting that information outside of the country while the window is open. And then finally, I think we really do have to talk about resources. So the sixth point I would say is we need dedicated resources. That's one of the things that I'm proud to say our government has recognized, in that after years of kleptocracy investigations being sort of part of another jurisdiction where it happened, where part of the crime occurred, we got resources in 2010 to focus by creating a kleptocracy asset recovery initiative, and we've also have a dedicated unit for prosecuting the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and having that expertise and that centralized mission for those types of crimes has been crucial. And similarly, having a dedicated investigative body to partner with the law enforcement has also been critical. So I think having dedicated resources for this has been essential. I think it's incumbent upon the rest of of the jurisdictions that are outside of the kleptocracies to do their part, to do the same thing, frankly, to have dedicated units that can open investigations, share information with other investigators, and hopefully take advantage of those opportunities of perhaps brash social media posts that we've seen, or the windows of opportunity when the brave investigators and journalists in the countries most affected by the kleptocracies are able to come forward. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and appreciate your time, and I look forward to our discussion.
So with that, I will turn it over to questions, but I'm going to take as moderator the opportunity to ask the first question, because Enrica actually provided me a question that I thought was great for encouraging discussion, and that is, would you just talk a little bit about what your perspective is on the link between violent kleptocracies and international funding?
Yeah, definitely. Hello? Can somebody turn on?
Mike?
Mic 3? Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much, Karen. I wanted to discuss that question because I think it's very important to keep in mind that any sector, any financial flow that is large or significant will sooner or later become a target of a kleptocrat. And we've seen that actually a lot, not just with mining, but also with aid increasingly. And it's a topic that maybe not everybody likes to talk about, and it's sensitive, and of course we don't want aid or loans coming in from multilateral development banks to stop with negative consequences for the people. But at the same time, we have to see what can we do to prevent this, and how do we do it in a coordinated manner where we discuss with our other partners and have the same kind of measures imposed by all of us, because otherwise it's really easy to be pitted against each other. Okay, now you are being difficult, you don't want me to access the funding. I just go to another embassy, or I go to another bank as such. And I think there's a lot to be done to improve this coordination, because otherwise it actually incentivizes, especially a violent kleptocratic regime, to keep the people poor, to conduct continued violence, because then more aid and more loans will be made available for the country. So I think we really have to look to that cycle of violence and do what we can to impose measures on all parts of the supply chain. Financial intermediaries, subcontractors, often they are excluded from transparency and accountability measures, and we should really make sure that they are also part of the reporting requirements, for example.
Thank you. Okay, first question, I think, all right, I'll take, and if you wouldn't mind standing and just giving your name and organization. And here, let me get you a mic.
Transparency International Kazakhstan. My name is Adeba. You mentioned the term illicit, but there is probably difference in the area of morale between legal funds and illicit funds, because legal funds can be illicit. What do you make of like a practical way how to crystallize that gap? And that question probably and Debra. And second question is to Brian and then Clay. You said about the end result of the sanctions of the game, and Brian, you mentioned that global financial system KYC procedures should be included. Do you think that also like international corporation, major business should be included? Because in my humble opinion, the DNA of corruption is in the foreign direct investment. So once there is huge flow of foreign direct investments, then that is the DNA of corruption. Then the power can give profit. And I wanted to mention a case when American legal system does have evidence, and about 20 years ago, New York court proved that two top managers of two American oil companies gave bribes to top officials in Kazakhstan. And one of these top managers paid a huge fine of $25. And major corporations, I understand, were not fined, and there was no consequence for them at all. So would it be correct to assume that international natural resources business is too hard of a challenge, not only for the judicial systems in the countries where they make profits, but also for American judicial system? That's a question to Brian and Dan. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to hog the mic again, but talking about illicit, it's a good question, right? And there's a massive debate ongoing on what is illicit financial flows, for example, and what do we call illicit. I do think recently the UN UNCTAD has clarified the definition a little bit with also stating that they do include the broader definition, or they do use the broader definition of illicit financial flows and include aggressive tax evasion, for example. But I think what I always look at is as illicit, it's not just the source of funds, but also the transfer methods. So there has to be some part of it has to be illicit. And you can have legal economies, but then if you pay bribe for that, or you take some money of that and you buy a property abroad, that's the illicit part then of it. And that's why I would include it like that. So it's the source of funds, but also the transfer methods, or maybe mixing it with other resources to hide that it is illicit. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and like from my FBI days, like tax evasion in the United States has not been a specified unlawful activity for us to go after. So yes, we might see money coming in and it's legally derived, but it's being offshored because they're doing tax evasion. It just, and Dan can speak to it better if it's changed, but 7 years ago, it was not a specified unlawful activity, therefore I couldn't go after the funds because it's not laundered if it's not dirty money, right? So it may be they're avoiding taxes, but it wasn't criminally derived. And so that's where, from my investigations, we were looking at procurement fraud, siphoning off, embezzlement, bribery, kickbacks, and the proceeds of a criminal conduct other than tax evasion.
I agree with you that foreign direct investment is an avenue for corrupt activity. In South Sudan in November, we saw the issue of Glencore being fined $314 million in a UK court for bribery activities that happen in Equatorial Guinea, South Sudan, Nigeria, and one other country I forget. But with regard to the issue of South Sudan, they paid allegedly $800 million to bribe officials to get a contract. And so yes, that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. And as investigators working on anti-corruption issues, we should always try to bring that into perspective. I'm happy that there was actually accountability in this case, where the company alleged in the wrongdoing was taken to court and actually made to pay for it. We as investigators, we need to be highlighting that component of potential corruption because it's actually always also overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you for the important and interesting questions. I think just briefly on the illicit bit, I think one of the challenges with corruption investigations inherently is that it involves often legal activity. Government has to provide for its communities. It has to build things. It needs to provide for health care. There are things that government has to do. And even corruption in the private sector is also important to be concerned about, because it's, the extraordinary sums, for example, were poured into research and development of the vaccines that made it possible for the IACC once again to come back together in person so we could have this discussion instead of having it on Zoom. And so I think it's important that it is a challenge because you're looking at illicit financial flows, illicit business activity, illicit government activity, but with oftentimes there's a criminal aspect to it, whether it's an illegal bribe payment, embezzlement, those types of things that, and even in academia, that may threaten the integrity of some of those healthcare breakthroughs. I think with regard to the second question about dealing with the international financial framework, I think there are two different types of pieces to the investigative puzzle in anti-corruption. There are things like beneficial ownership registries. Those are going to be more important when you're talking about shell companies and individuals who are trying to benefit from the criminal enterprises or who are making the payments. And so we certainly have to harden our financial systems to expose those and make it less possible for people to conceal their criminal activity within legal behavior. I think the other part, when you're talking about multinational corporations and investment, those again are important to be concerned about. And I think at least in the U.S. we try to prosecute Foreign Corrupt Practices Act cases, for example, those bribery payments and things for companies that even trade in the United States, are traded in the United States, fall within our jurisdiction. And we encourage our partners around the world to do similar types of things. So I think we've seen over the last several years a proliferation of FCPA-like instruments, like the UK Bribery Act, which I think came in 2010, thereabouts. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was in the 1970s. It was one of the post-Watergate statutes. And so I think we do need more enforcement worldwide on that. But I think we also need more accountability and to work with the business communities to make it so that they are aware where they're vulnerable to corruption. So I think it's partly compliance and it's partly accountability. They go hand in hand.
Next question. Hello? Okay, next question. And if you wouldn't mind just keeping it to one question because we're running short of time. Again, your name and your organization or...
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Georgi Oniani. I represent Transparency International Georgia. Thank you for a wonderful panel. I mean, each and every panelist has been very, very interesting. My question probably goes to Dan, a very specific one. So we're talking about the violent kleptocracies, and also we see that, unfortunately, some of the measures taken by the international community and those sanctions, they don't really work. So the question is, so at what point the jurisdictions like US, for instance, would regard that they're ready to intervene before this regime becomes violent? Because in Georgia, we're having a textbook example of state capture. We're having all the institutions controlled by the ruling party, and we have one single man, the richest man in the country, effectively a Russian oligarch behind the ruling party who has basically his loyal people in all those positions, his assistants, his bodyguards, his private doctors serving as ministers of different kind. So, but they're, little by little, they're also getting some violent. They're getting violent, but the thing is that it's not that much, I would say, not that much evidence is available. We have some people coming out. We have certain people who leaked to us some information. Some of them were arrested. But so would that be enough, one? And secondly, or the first question would be, so to what extent, when would you be ready to intervene? So should they really start killing and arresting people, or it can be kind of preempted? Thank you.
Thank you for the interesting question. I should sort of preface, and probably should have prefaced my remarks as saying I can't really speak to a particular country's situation. I think we have a number of different equities from different parts of the U.S. government that would be able to specify sort of give you a more knowledgeable response with respect to Georgia. I think if you were asking about intervention generally, where a jurisdiction is turning from kleptocracy to violent kleptocracy, I think that's a very complex question. The United States doesn't, as far as I'm aware, have really a policy of intervening in other countries, if you mean by military means. By sanctions. Okay, so if you're talking about sanctions, I think there are a variety of different elements that go into a sanctions program, and also a variety of different sanction authorities. There are visa denials and revocations, which restrict the movements of kleptocrats. Often aren't as public as many people might want, because generally speaking in the United States, those are more private information, and where the kleptocrat makes it public, it's a lot easier for us to disseminate. But there are also financial sanctions that, and we are using and have used that tool, I think with some success, to make it much more difficult for people to use the proceeds of corruption in the West. And we may not be able to completely shut them out of every financial market in the world, although I think there's a growing coalition of countries that have been willing to use sanctions, particularly in the situation of Ukraine, to make that the perpetrators of the brutal invasion there and their associates more isolated. So I think there is increased use of sanctions. I think there's increased coordination on sanctions, and I do think that they have an effect. Are we going to be able to use sanctions in every situation? Probably not, because those sanctions are not imposed without an evidentiary basis. And so it may not be the same thing as going into court with trial evidence, but there is a evidentiary basis that has to be developed, in order to impose sanctions. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to talk a little bit about the EU, because we are talking about Georgia. And I think the EU has a big role, and there's a large reckoning within the union and also its backyard states that maybe want to become a member, or there's a lot of collaboration and trade with. And we see in some instances that, for example, the US is sanctioning officials in Bosnia or in Moldova, and there's a shock going through the union of, oh my God, like it's our backyard. And so there is an increasing awareness of this. I think the EU is also looking at anti-corruption sanctions, which we don't have, and the union has been misused by also businessmen that my colleagues have exposed, that are sanctioned by the US or UK and then use the European Union to continue their trade. So I think, yes, the US is important in this sense, but I think also the EU, because if you look at trade and aid and other flows to Georgia, I think the EU is probably a larger contributor. So feel free, please, to submit sanction dossiers, push for anti-corruption sanctions, and I hope things will stop and the union will go after these issues in its own backyard a lot more than it has in the past.
All right, my mic keeps getting, we have a person in the back who's been waving her hand at me, so I'm going to come all the way back here. She's been very patient. And again, please give your name and your affiliation.
Daphne Bourgoin from Haiti. We've been pushing for sanctions for a while. We're finally seeing our, what I would call a window of opportunity, with Canada and the US giving out some sanctions for the past few weeks. But at the same time, we're a bit confused, because the same international community giving out these sanctions is still supporting the government capturing our state. So how do we move past that? How do we make sure that, as was mentioned, these sanctions have the right political strategy behind them, and that they're being followed through, so that they're not just sanctions and visa cancellation and sanctions.
Let me attempt that. I think when you look at how governments work, they deal with the so-called legitimate authority in the country, and in international relations, that's what really is. Whether that entity is really bad or not, there are certain government-to-government functions that need to happen. For instance, in the case of Haiti, whether it's developmental aid, perhaps you need that cooperation of the legitimate authority in power. It may not be, that legitimacy may be contested in Haiti, but if you're an external entity and you're going to deal with Haiti on national issues, you still have to deal with that authority. Yes, that's a dichotomy there. But again, I think we need to divorce this idea from our heads that sanctions in and of themselves are a solution. Sanctions are not. They're just a component of the solution. They aid a certain strategy to arrive at a certain endpoint that is desired. And in a situation like that, I think there is need for a lot of advocacy towards, for instance, the governments that are working with the government in Haiti, to also be cognizant of their role in supporting or enabling the system to continue perpetuating what it is doing in the country to the detriment of the people. That's my take.
All right, so we're getting close to end of time, so I'll take 3 more questions. 1, 2, 3, all the way in the back there.
Thank you. My name is Damilola. I'm one of the reporters reporting this conference for Transparency International. My question is directed to... Could you please speak up? I can hardly hear you. Oh, okay. My question is directed to Debra, and any other person could answer it. You mentioned there is a connection between resources and human rights violation. You gave example of rape. Here's my question. Are these offenses an incentive, or what are the reasons these exist? There exists this relationship between resources and such human rights violations. Thank you.
Yeah, well, what we found is that the numbers of rapes committed by the army in South Sudan had increased 5-fold over a 3 to 5 year period. So we started looking at why and where the rapes are occurring, who's doing them, and what is the motivation. Like, why suddenly is there a 5-fold increase in the number of rape and gang rapes by the military? And that's why we looked at where were they occurring. And what we found is where they were occurring is where the military was protecting resources. So right there, that is a financial link, because 95% of the revenue of South Sudan is oil. So the military is placed in areas where they're protecting the government's cash cow, the oil fields. And what we found is that entire areas were being displaced. Like a village would be burned out, but the women were targeted for sexual gender-based violence, and so that they would leave the area, and troops could come in and maybe take over a illegal teak. We know that a lot of the military has not been paid for long periods of time in South Sudan. So what we would see is that the military was funding itself or paying its own soldiers by cutting down and harvesting teak, using government vehicles to transport the teak into Uganda so it could be sold, taking over artisanal mining operations. And I went to Uganda, and I went to 3 refugee camps, and I interviewed women who had been raped by the military. And I would ask them, like, is there a financial motivation, like, you know, and they're like, they didn't see it. They're like, no, they're Dinka, I'm Nyor, they didn't like me, that's why I was attacked. But I'd say, are the soldiers like mining in your area? Have they taken over the teak harvesting? And all of them said, well, yes. So, I mean, so the military was funding itself and profiting from, and then we took, what the next level up is where you saw that all of the people who were giving the orders to those troops own oil transport companies, service protective and security services that were providing services in those areas. So can you separate yourself saying, my family sells the petroleum that's coming out of this field, I run the troops here, and I need my troops to be in control of this region, and that they're being told, I mean, the military, the United Nations put out a report several years ago, and it said, in South Sudan, the army is allowed to rape in lieu of pay. So you haven't been paid for 6 months, so you're given carte blanche to do whatever you want with impunity. And so that was one of the ways they profited. There were rape camps set up as reward for fighting. So again, another monetary reason why there was an increase in the incident of rape and gang rape in South Sudan.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. So my question, my name is Dilmira Matikpour. I'm from Uzbekistan, Uz Investigations. So my questions related to PEPs, like politically exposed persons. So we have a case of a kleptocrat who is now in jail, who's the daughter of the former president, a dictator, who run basically a state racket. And she, although is able now to rule that, you know, she can get money like around 300 million back, because the court, the Swedish and the Swiss court, ruled that she was not a PEP. So she was operating behind the scenes. So in a context of an authoritarian kleptocracy like Uzbekistan, you have people operating behind the scenes. They may not be politicians, but they have the power to use, you know, the for money laundering, extortion, all that state racket, but they're not necessarily recognized as politically exposed persons. But we looked at the definitions, all the available definitions of PEP, but she was within the definitions, you know, she fell, because she had positions in the ministry, she had positions in the UN, but despite that, the rules in the European countries, that just like simply recognized her as not PEP. So she's able now to get money back. Basically, we are failing the asset recovery, you know, program. Thank you.
Because in the U.S., we would recognize the family members of politically exposed persons as a PEP. I mean, if you look at, Obiang's son, obviously, he's also the vice president, so he's a PEP in his own right. But if he weren't, he's still profiting from his father's kleptocracy. You look at Isabel dos Santos. You look at some of the richest women in the world, and they are the daughters of foreign, richest woman in Venezuela is Maria Chavez, the daughter of Hugo Chavez. Isabel dos Santos is one. The daughters of, I think, it's Azerbaijan and other countries. So it's interesting. I mean, I think it was the FATF definition was expanded to include the family members. So what you'd have to do if you want to go after them is look at who, if they're not going to be addressed in their country, who has the best venue, who also has venue, and then try to work in those countries. Like France went after Obiang, the United States went after Teodoro Obiang. So, who else can if those internal countries won't recognize them?
Yeah. Hello. If I could just very briefly address, I think a politically exposed person is a useful definition, particularly for preventive measures, for banks to identify who their clients are and to take countermeasures to protect. I think ultimately, in terms of criminal responsibility or for forfeiture circumstances and restraints, often PEP status is not necessarily enough. You have to show criminal responsibility. And that's going to be different under different legal systems. And so that's, I think, one of the things that you're seeing is that there's different types of criminal responsibility that different countries use. And then just very briefly on Haiti, again, I'm not here to address particular country situations, but I think it's important to note the tragedy and suffering of the Haitian people that they have seen over the last several months. And I think some of the importance of sanctions, where sanctions were discussed, is sanctions are much more effective when they are collectively used, because you isolate people more. And so one of the things that our government has done in the Haitian situation has been to push for sanctions successfully in the UN. But it also it is sanctions, as Brian said, are not the only tool and are not going to be a solution by themselves. But it is very concerning what's happening in Haiti.
All right, I apologize, but I'm being told that we must cut it right now. So, but the speakers will be outside if you would like to ask them individual questions. And thank you all for coming this morning and for participating and asking questions. And enjoy the rest of the conference.